Mr. Hemsley, do you know who I am? The question hung in the air of the boardroom like a death sentence. Richard Hemsley, once the king of Caribbean luxury hospitality, now sat across from the one person who held the power to save or destroy what little remained of his crumbling empire. His hands trembled as they rested on the mahogany table. The man asking the question looked to be in his late 20s, impeccably dressed, with eyes that carried something Richard couldn't quite place. Familiarity? No. Something deeper. Something that made his chest tighten with an inexplicable dread. I'm sorry, I don't believe we've met, Richard managed, his voice cracking in a way it hadn't since he was a young man. The younger man smiled. It wasn't cruel. It wasn't kind either. It was the smile of someone who had waited a very long time for this exact moment. No, we haven't met. But you knew my mother once. Very well, in fact. Have you ever watched someone's entire world collapse in the span of a heartbeat? That moment when everything they thought was buried comes roaring back to demand its due. Because karma doesn't forget. It doesn't forgive. It simply waits for the perfect moment to present the bill for debts long overdue. And sometimes, that bill comes delivered by the very people you threw away like garbage. Hey, how are you doing today? Whether you're watching from New York, London, Kingston, or anywhere else in this world, I hope you're comfortable because the story you're about to hear is one that will remind you that what you do in the darkness always finds its way to the light. Grab your coffee, settle in, and let me tell you about Richard Hemsley and the Jamaican wife he discarded like yesterday's newspaper. This is the story of Nia Campbell, a woman who went from being humiliated and abandoned with a newborn baby to becoming the mother of one of the most powerful men in international business. This is the story of how a man who thought he could erase his past discovered that the past was simply waiting, growing stronger, and preparing to rewrite his future. The moment I'm describing to you, that confrontation in the boardroom, that came after 28 years of secrets, lies, and a justice so perfectly timed it could only be divine. But let me start from the beginning, back when Nia Campbell was just a 23-year-old girl who believed that love could bridge any gap, and Richard Hemsley was a 31-year-old hotel heir who thought he could have his cake and eat it too. Before we dive deep into this journey, do me a favor. If you appreciate stories about resilience, about underdogs who rise, about justice that feels so satisfying it gives you chills, go ahead and hit that like button. Subscribe to the channel because we bring you real stories about real consequences. Share this with someone who needs to remember that betrayal never goes unpunished. And comment below telling me where you're watching from and if you've ever seen karma work its magic in real life. Now, let me take you back to the beginning. The year was 1995, and Richard Hemsley was riding high on inheritance and arrogance. His father had just passed, leaving him a chain of 3 boutique hotels across the Caribbean, one in Barbados, one in Trinidad, and the crown jewel in Montego Bay, Jamaica. Richard had been groomed his entire life to take over the family business, educated at expensive schools in England, taught to value prestige, image, and the kind of old-money snobbery that valued bloodlines over character. Nia Campbell, on the other hand, came from what people politely called humble beginnings. She grew up in a small district outside of Kingston, the daughter of a fisherman and a seamstress. She had worked her way through hospitality school on scholarships and sheer determination, dreaming of a career in hotel management. She was beautiful, not in the polished magazine way, but in the way that made people turn around when she walked by. She had warm brown skin that glowed in the Caribbean sun, natural hair she wore in styles that showed her pride in her heritage, and a smile that could light up a room. They met at the Montego Bay property. Richard had come to inspect his new acquisition, and Nia was working the front desk, filling in for a colleague who had called in sick. She wasn't supposed to be there that day. Funny how fate works like that. Richard noticed her immediately. Not just her beauty, but her competence. She handled a difficult guest with such grace and professionalism that he found himself impressed despite his usual dismissiveness of staff. He asked the manager about her. The manager praised her work ethic, her attention to detail, her natural talent for making guests feel valued. Richard made it a point to return to that hotel more frequently than business required. For Nia, Richard represented something she had never encountered before. He was worldly, educated, confident. He told her stories about London, about Paris, about places she had only seen in magazines. He seemed genuinely interested in her thoughts, her dreams, her opinions. When he asked her to dinner, she hesitated. She knew the gulf between them. She knew what people would say. But Richard was persistent. He promised her that none of that mattered. He said he saw something special in her, something real in a world full of fake people. He said she made him feel grounded, authentic, alive in a way his usual social circle never did. Nia believed him. Why wouldn't she? She was 23 years old, and a successful, handsome man was treating her like she mattered. Like she was special. They dated for 8 months before Richard proposed. It wasn't a grand public gesture. He gave her a simple ring and promised her a life together. Nia said yes with her whole heart. She introduced him to her family, who were wary but hopeful. Richard was polite to them, though Nia sometimes caught a tightness in his smile when her father talked about his fishing boats or her mother discussed her sewing clients. She told herself she was imagining it. They married quietly in a small ceremony in Jamaica. Richard said he wanted something intimate, just them and a few close friends. Nia didn't question why none of his family attended. He said they were traditional and didn't approve of quick engagements. He promised they would come around. Nia moved into Richard's villa overlooking the bay. It was the most beautiful place she had ever lived. For a few months, she thought she was living a fairy tale. Richard seemed happy. They talked about the future. He even suggested she might take on a management role at one of the hotels once she gained more experience. Then Nia got pregnant. She told Richard with joy in her heart, expecting him to share her excitement. Instead, she watched something shift in his eyes. Something cold and calculating that she had never seen before. "Are you sure?" he asked. "Yes, I took 3 tests. Richard, we're going to have a baby." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "That's wonderful, darling. Just unexpected. We'll need to figure things out." Nia didn't understand what there was to figure out. They were married. They loved each other. A baby was a blessing. But over the following weeks, Richard became distant. He traveled more. He came home late. When Nia tried to talk to him about baby names or nursery colors, he seemed distracted, impatient. She was 5 months pregnant when she first heard about Victoria Laurent. A friend from her old hospitality program called her, voice tight with concern. "Nia, I don't know how to tell you this, but I saw Richard last night in Kingston. He was at that new upscale restaurant on the waterfront. He wasn't alone." Nia's heart dropped. "Business dinner?" "Nia," he was holding her hand. They were looking at each other the way couples look at each other. Nia confronted Richard that night. He denied everything at first, then admitted it was a business associate, then finally, when pressed, he exploded. "What did you expect, Nia? You think I can bring you around my associates? You think I can introduce a front desk clerk to investors and partners? You're a sweet girl, but this was never going to work long term. I thought you understood that." Nia felt the ground disappear beneath her feet. "I'm your wife. I'm carrying your child." "A mistake," Richard said coldly. "One I'm willing to take financial responsibility for, but Nia, be realistic. Victoria Laurent is the daughter of a French hotel magnate. A partnership with her family could expand my empire across Europe. She's educated, sophisticated, from the right kind of family. She's what I need for the life I'm building. You married me, Nia whispered, her hand protectively over her growing belly. I married you because I was grieving my father and you were a distraction. A beautiful distraction, but a distraction nonetheless. I'll make sure you're taken care of. I'm not a monster. But this marriage is over. Nia couldn't breathe. Couldn't think. The man she loved, the father of her unborn child, was looking at her like she was a problem to be solved, an embarrassment to be managed. If you're listening to this and you've ever been made to feel small, like you didn't matter, like you were disposable, you know the pain Nia felt in that moment. It wasn't just heartbreak. It was humiliation. It was the destruction of every dream she had built. But here's what Richard Hemsley didn't know about Nia Campbell. He didn't know that beneath her gentle nature was a spine made of steel. He didn't know that the same determination that got her through hospitality school on scholarships would carry her through the darkest days of her life. He didn't know that the baby she was carrying would become the instrument of a justice so perfect, it would echo across decades. All Richard knew was that he wanted his Jamaican wife gone before Victoria arrived for the winter season. And what Richard Hemsley wanted, Richard Hemsley got. Or so he thought. Richard didn't waste time with sentimentality. Within 3 days of that devastating conversation, he had his lawyer draw up divorce papers. Not just any lawyer, but the most expensive one on the island, a man known for making inconvenient marriages disappear quietly and completely. The lawyer's name was Gerald Thornton, a Brit who had relocated to Jamaica decades ago and made his fortune helping wealthy men protect their assets from what he called unfortunate entanglements. He sat across from Nia in Richard's study, a room she had always felt uncomfortable in with its dark wood and stuffed animal heads mounted on the walls like trophies. Mrs. Hemsley, Thornton began, his tone professionally condescending, my client is prepared to be quite generous given the circumstances. Nia sat with her hands folded over her belly, now visibly swollen with 6 months of pregnancy. She hadn't slept in 3 days. Her eyes were swollen from crying. But she was there, trying to understand how her life had fallen apart so completely. Generous, she repeated, her voice hollow. Indeed. Mr. Hemsley is offering a one-time settlement of $50,000. Additionally, he will provide $500 per month in child support until the child reaches 18. In exchange, you will sign these documents acknowledging that the marriage was a mistake, that you entered into it under false pretenses regarding your background and education, and that you make no claim to any of Mr. Hemsley's assets, properties, or business interests. Nia's head snapped up. False pretenses? I never lied about anything. Thornton smiled thinly. Mrs. Hemsley, you allowed my client to believe you were from a certain class of family. You presented yourself as educated and cultured when in fact you come from quite humble origins. My client feels deceived. I worked the front desk when we met. He knew exactly who I was. Nevertheless, these are the terms. You can accept them, or we can proceed with a contested divorce that will be far more unpleasant and expensive for you. I should mention that my client is prepared to fight for full custody of the child, citing your unstable financial situation and lack of proper resources to raise a child in appropriate circumstances. The threat hit Nia like a physical blow. He would take her baby. This man who didn't want them, who was throwing them away, would still take her child just to punish her for not going quietly. Where is Richard? Nia demanded. I want to talk to him directly. Mr. Hemsley is in Barbados on business. He felt it would be easier for all parties if I handled the legal matters. He couldn't even face her. The man who had whispered promises in her ear, who had made love to her, who had created a life with her, couldn't even be in the same room when he destroyed her. Nia's mother, Pearl Campbell, had warned her. The day Richard proposed, Pearl had taken her daughter's hands and said, "Baby girl, I want you to be happy." But men like that, they don't see us the same way. We're exotic to them, exciting, but when it comes to building a life, they go back to their own kind. I'm not saying don't love him. I'm just saying protect yourself. Nia had been offended at the time. She thought her mother was being cynical, letting old prejudices cloud her judgment. Richard was different. Richard loved her for who she was. How spectacularly wrong she had been. "I need time to think," Nia said quietly. "You have 48 hours. After that, the offer reduces to 25,000, and we proceed with the custody filing." Nia left that meeting feeling like a ghost. She drove back to the villa, this beautiful prison that had once felt like a dream home. Richard's clothes were gone from the closet. His toiletries removed from the bathroom. It was like he had never been there at all. Like their entire relationship had been erased in the time it took her to meet with a lawyer. She called her mother, sobbing so hard she could barely speak. Pearl Campbell arrived within 2 hours, her face set in that expression of maternal fury and heartbreak. She held her daughter while Nia cried, stroking her hair the way she had when Nia was a little girl with scraped knees. "Mama, what do I do?" Nia asked. "You survive, baby. You survive, and you raise that baby with your head high. That man is going to regret this. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but one day he's going to look back and realize what he threw away. He's offering money. Not much, but enough to start over somewhere." Pearl pulled back to look at her daughter's face. "Take the money. Not because you need his charity, but because that baby deserves every penny from its father. You sign whatever papers you have to sign to keep your child safe. But Nia, you listen to me. This doesn't define you. This doesn't diminish you. You are worth more than this man could ever comprehend." Nia signed the papers the next day. Her hand shook so badly she could barely hold the pen. Thornton had her sign 9 different documents, each one more humiliating than the last. One acknowledged that she had misrepresented her social standing. Another waived any claim to Richard's estate. A third agreed to a gag order, preventing her from speaking publicly about Richard or their marriage to any media outlets or business associates. In exchange, she received a check for $50,000 and a promise of monthly child support payments. "You have 1 week to vacate the property," Thornton informed her. "Mr. Hemsley will be returning with his fiancée, and he would prefer the transition to be clean." Fiancée. He was already calling Victoria his fiancée. The divorce wasn't even final. "How long?" Nia asked quietly. "I beg your pardon. How long has he been with her?" "Victoria Laurent." "How long?" Thornton had the decency to look uncomfortable. "I'm not at liberty to discuss my client's personal relationships." "How long?" Nia's voice was steel now. Thornton sighed. "They've been acquainted for approximately 18 months. But Mrs. Hemsley, I assure you this was purely a business relationship until very recently." 18 months. Nia had been married for 14 months. She had been pregnant for 6. Richard had known Victoria Laurent before he even proposed. Possibly before they even started dating. Everything had been a lie. All of it. Nia moved out 5 days later. Her father and 2 of her brothers came with a borrowed truck to collect her belongings. Richard still hadn't returned. He had orchestrated the entire dissolution of their marriage from a distance, like a CEO handling an underperforming asset. As Nia took one last look at the villa, she saw workers already repainting the bedroom. Erasing any trace of her existence. Preparing for Victoria's arrival. Her brother Michael put a hand on her shoulder. He's not worth your tears, sis. I know, Nia said. But she cried anyway during the entire drive back to her parents' small house in Kingston. The house where she had grown up was a 3-bedroom wooden structure painted cheerful yellow, with a garden where her mother grew vegetables and herbs. It sat in a neighborhood where everyone knew everyone, where children played in the streets, where the sound of reggae mixed with gospel music on Sunday mornings. It was the complete opposite of Richard's world of luxury hotels and high society. And right now, it was the only place Nia felt safe. Pearl had prepared the smallest bedroom for Nia, the one that had been hers as a child. She had painted it fresh white and added curtains with little flowers. It was simple, clean, and filled with love. Nia lay on the narrow bed and wondered how she would raise a baby in this tiny room when just days ago she had been planning a nursery in a mansion. The gossip started almost immediately. Jamaica was a small island, and the story of Richard Hemsley's Jamaican wife being replaced by a French socialite spread like wildfire. Nia couldn't go to the market without seeing people whisper. Former colleagues from the hotel wouldn't meet her eyes. The humiliation was suffocating. But worse than the gossip was the silence from Richard. No phone call to check on her or the baby. No message asking how she was coping. Nothing. He had completely cut her out of his life as thoroughly as if she had never existed. 3 months later, Nia gave birth to a son. The labor was long and difficult. Her mother held one hand, her father the other. The baby came into the world screaming, healthy and perfect, with a full head of dark hair and eyes that would eventually settle into a striking hazel. "What will you name him?" the nurse asked. Nia looked down at her son, this tiny person who was now her entire world. She thought about giving him Richard's name as tradition would dictate. But why should this child carry the name of a man who wanted nothing to do with him? "Josiah," she said firmly. "Josiah Campbell. After my grandfather." The nurse wrote it down. No Hemsley. No connection to Richard whatsoever. If Richard wanted to erase them from his life, Nia would return the favor. She sent a single message through the lawyer informing Richard of the birth. She received a response 3 weeks later, a standard legal acknowledgement and confirmation that child support payments would begin as contracted. No congratulations. No request to see his son. No acknowledgement that he had just become a father. It was in that moment, holding 3-week-old Josiah in her arms while reading that cold, clinical letter, that something fundamental shifted in Nia Campbell. The grief began to transform into something else. Not anger exactly, though there was plenty of that. It was determination. It was a fierce protective instinct. It was a promise to herself and to her son that they would not just survive this, they would thrive. Richard Hemsley thought he could throw them away and move on with his life of luxury and social climbing. He thought Nia and their son were beneath him, unworthy of his world. Nia decided she would prove him wrong. Not for him. Not for revenge. But for Josiah. Her son would never feel less than anyone. Her son would have every opportunity. Her son would grow up knowing his worth had nothing to do with his father's rejection. Meanwhile, across the island in Montego Bay, Richard Hemsley was celebrating. He had married Victoria Laurent in an elaborate ceremony attended by hotel industry elites from around the world. The wedding was featured in Caribbean travel magazines. Victoria wore a dress that cost more than Nia's entire settlement. Richard's best man, his childhood friend Christopher Dane, pulled him aside during the reception. "You sure you did the right thing with that girl? With your son?" Richard sipped his champagne, watching Victoria charm a group of potential investors. "What girl?" "I'm a married man, Chris. First time, actually, in the only way that counts. You know what I mean. The Jamaican woman. You have a kid out there. I have a financial obligation that I'm meeting. Beyond that, it's not my concern. That was a phase, a mistake. He gestured to the opulent reception, to Victoria sparkling in diamonds, this is my real life. Christopher didn't look convinced, but he dropped it. People didn't question Richard Hemsley when his mind was made up. Victoria Laurent was everything Richard wanted in a wife. She was beautiful in the polished, elegant way of European aristocracy. She spoke 4 languages fluently. She had connections to old money families across France and Switzerland. Her father owned a luxury hotel chain that made Richard's 3 properties look quaint. She was also cold, calculating, and married Richard for exactly the same reasons he married her, strategic advancement. Their marriage was a business merger disguised as a romance. They looked perfect in photographs. They attended the right parties, knew the right people, made the right investments. Within 2 years, Richard's hotel empire had expanded to 7 properties across the Caribbean and 2 in the French Riviera. Richard convinced himself he had made the right choice. He barely thought about Nia anymore. When he did, it was with a vague sense of having dodged a bullet. Imagine if he had stayed with her. Imagine trying to bring a simple island girl to business dinners with European hotel magnates. Imagine the embarrassment. He never asked about his son. The child support payments were handled automatically by his accountant. As far as Richard was concerned, those $500 a month were the price of his freedom from a mistake. But mistakes have a way of growing up. They have a way of remembering. And they have a way of coming back when you least expect them. Back in Kingston, Nia was learning to navigate single motherhood with grace and grit. The $50,000 she had received went into a savings account that she refused to touch except for absolute emergencies. The monthly child support covered basics, but Nia was determined to provide for her son through her own work, not Richard's guilt money. She took a job at a small guest house in Kingston, working her way up from housekeeping supervisor to assistant manager within a year. The owner, an older Jamaican woman named Miss Claudette, saw something in Nia that reminded her of herself. "You've got steel in you, girl," Miss Claudette said one day. "Life tried to break you, but here you are, still standing." "I have to stand," Nia replied, thinking of Josiah sleeping peacefully in the small nursery she had set up in Miss Claudette's office. "I have someone depending on me." Miss Claudette became more than a boss. She became a mentor, teaching Nia everything she knew about running a hospitality business. She let Nia bring Josiah to work, setting up a playpen where the little boy would babble and play while his mother worked. Nia saved every extra penny. She took online courses in business management. She studied hotel administration textbooks borrowed from the library. She was building something, though she wasn't quite sure what yet. Josiah grew from a baby into a toddler who was curious about everything. He had his mother's warm brown skin and bright smile, but his eyes, those hazel eyes, came from Richard. Sometimes Nia would look at her son and see flashes of the man who had broken her heart. But then Josiah would laugh or hug her or say, "Mama," with such pure love that any resemblance to Richard disappeared. This boy was nothing like his father. This boy was being raised with love, community, and the knowledge that people's worth wasn't measured in money or social status. When Josiah was 3 years old, Nia made a decision. She sat down with her son, though he was too young to fully understand, and she made him a promise. "Baby boy, I'm going to make sure you have every opportunity in this world. Your father didn't want us, but that's his loss. You are going to grow up strong, educated, and proud of exactly who you are. We may not have fancy houses or expensive cars, but we have something better. We have love, and we have determination, and we have each other." Josiah nodded seriously, the way 3-year-olds do when they don't fully comprehend but sense the importance of the moment. Nia kept that promise. She worked multiple jobs. She enrolled Josiah in the best school she could afford. She made sure he had books, music lessons, and exposure to ideas beyond their small neighborhood. And she never, not once, spoke badly about Richard to their son. When Josiah was old enough to ask about his father, Nia simply said, "Your daddy lives far away and has a different life. But that has nothing to do with how special and loved you are." What Nia didn't know was that her son, even at a young age, was extraordinary. Josiah wasn't just bright, he was brilliant. By age 5, he was reading at a third-grade level. By age 7, he was solving math problems that stumped kids twice his age. By age 10, he was writing computer code. Nia nurtured every talent, every interest, every spark of genius she saw in her son. She found free coding camps. She borrowed computers from Miss Claudette's guest house. She encouraged every question, every curiosity, every ambitious dream. "Mama, one day I'm going to be rich," Josiah announced when he was 12. "I'm going to buy you a big house and you won't have to work so hard." Nia smiled and kissed his forehead. "Baby, I don't need a big house. But I love that you dream big." "I'm serious, Mama. I'm going to create something important. Something that changes things." Nia believed him. How could she not? This child who had been rejected before he was even born, who had been deemed unworthy by his own father, was becoming something remarkable. But she had no idea just how remarkable he would become. She had no idea that the baby Richard Hemsley had thrown away would grow into the man who would one day hold Richard's entire future in his hands. Justice was being prepared. It was just taking its time, growing up, getting educated, becoming powerful enough to matter. And Richard Hemsley, living his life of luxury with Victoria, expanding his empire, attending exclusive parties, and congratulating himself on his successful life choices, had no idea what was coming. He had forgotten about Nia Campbell and the son he never wanted. Completely erased them from his mind and his history. That forgetting would become the most expensive mistake of his life. Richard Hemsley's life with Victoria Laurent looked perfect from the outside. And for the first 5 years of their marriage, it was profitable enough that he didn't notice what was missing. Victoria brought exactly what she promised: connections. Her father, Philippe Laurent, opened doors that Richard had been knocking on for years. Within 18 months of their wedding, Richard had secured partnerships with European luxury travel groups. Within 3 years, he had expanded from 7 properties to 15, stretching from the Caribbean to the Mediterranean. The Hemsley Hotel Group became a recognized name in luxury hospitality. Richard was featured in industry magazines. He spoke at conferences. He was invited to exclusive investment summits where deals worth millions were made over cocktails and golf games. But success came with a price tag that Richard didn't fully calculate until it was too late. Victoria had expensive tastes that made Richard's previous lifestyle look modest. She redecorated each of their homes every 2 years. She insisted on maintaining residences in Montego Bay, London, and Nice. She wore only designer clothing and refused to be seen in the same outfit twice at major events. "Darling, image is everything in this business," she would say when Richard hesitantly mentioned the spending. "We can't expect people to trust us with luxury hospitality if we don't embody luxury ourselves." Richard agreed, even as the expenses mounted. He took out loans to fund expansions. He leveraged properties to acquire new ones. He made increasingly risky investments to maintain the growth that Victoria and her father expected. Philippe Laurent had made it clear from the beginning, the partnership between their families was contingent on growth. "Stagnation is death in this industry, Richard," Philippe had told him over dinner shortly after the wedding. "You either expand or you become irrelevant." So Richard expanded. Sometimes wisely, often not. He acquired a failing resort in Turks and Caicos that needed massive renovation. He invested in a boutique hotel in Miami that had structural problems the inspectors somehow missed. He partnered with a development group in the Bahamas that turned out to have questionable financial backing. But the money kept flowing. Guests kept coming. The Hemsley name kept rising in prestige. Richard convinced himself that the risk was worth the reward. What he didn't know was that Victoria had her own agenda. She wasn't just spending Richard's money on clothes and homes. She was funneling significant amounts into private accounts. She was building relationships with Richard's business partners independently, positioning herself as the real power behind the Hemsley empire. She was preparing for a future that didn't necessarily include Richard long-term. Victoria Laurent had learned from her father that marriage was business, and business required exit strategies. Meanwhile, in Kingston, Nia was facing her own point of no return. Josiah was 14 years old, and his brilliance was becoming impossible to ignore. He had won every academic competition his school offered. He had taught himself 3 programming languages. He had built a website for Miss Claudette's guesthouse that increased their bookings by 40%. He was operating at a level that his small school couldn't support anymore. His headmaster, Mr. Livingston, called Nia in for a meeting. "Mrs. Campbell, I'm going to be direct with you. Josiah is the most gifted student I've encountered in 30 years of teaching. He needs opportunities we simply cannot provide here." Nia felt pride and panic in equal measure. "What are you suggesting?" "There's a scholarship program, the Caribbean Scholars Initiative. It places exceptional students in prestigious schools abroad. Full scholarship, including room and board. I've already taken the liberty of submitting Josiah's application. He's been accepted to 3 schools. 1 in Canada, 1 in England, and 1 in the United States. Sent her 14-year-old son away. To another country. Away from everything and everyone he knew." Nia's first instinct was to refuse. She had already lost so much. How could she send away the one person who made her life meaningful? But then she thought about the promise she had made when Josiah was 3 years old. Every opportunity. No limitations. A future not defined by his father's rejection. "I need to discuss it with Josiah," Nia said quietly. That night, mother and son sat on their small porch, listening to the sounds of their neighborhood. Music from a nearby house. Children playing. Dogs barking. The familiar soundtrack of their life. "Mr. Livingston says you got into some fancy schools," Nia began. Josiah nodded. "I was going to tell you. I wasn't sure how you'd feel about it." "How do you feel about it?" Josiah was quiet for a long moment. At 14, he already had the thoughtful demeanor of someone much older. "Mama, I love it here. I love you, Grandma, Grandpa, everyone. But I also know that if I stay, I'll always wonder what I could have become. I'm good at things, Mama. Really good. And I want to see how good I can get." Nia's heart broke and swelled at the same time. "Which school do you want to attend?" "There's one in Massachusetts. It's one of the best STEM schools in the world. Kids there are building apps, creating technology, starting companies. That's what I want to do, Mama. I want to build something important." "When would you leave?" "The fall semester starts in 3 months. 3 months. Nia had 3 months left with her son before he went to the other side of the world. "Okay," she said, her voice steady despite the tears on her cheeks. "Okay, baby. You're going to go to Massachusetts and you're going to be brilliant and you're going to make me proud. You already make me proud." Josiah hugged his mother tight. "I'm going to make something of myself, Mama. I promise. Everything you sacrificed, everything you gave up, it's going to mean something." Nia held her son and wondered how Richard could have walked away from this extraordinary person. His loss, she reminded herself. His monumental loss. The next 3 months passed in a blur of preparation. Nia worked extra shifts to buy Josiah the supplies he needed. Her parents contributed what they could. Miss Claudette gave Nia a bonus that she claimed was for exceptional work, but everyone knew was to help with Josiah's expenses. The community rallied around them. Neighbors donated winter clothes since Josiah had never experienced real cold. The church held a fundraiser. Josiah's teachers wrote glowing recommendation letters and gave him advice about navigating a new culture. The day Josiah left for Massachusetts, half the neighborhood came to the airport. Nia held herself together until her son disappeared through security, and then she wept in her mother's arms. "He's going to do great things," Pearl said. "You raised a lion, Nia. Now you have to let him roar." Josiah called his mother every week without fail. He told her about the school, about the incredible resources, about the other students who were just as driven and brilliant as he was. He told her about the coding projects he was working on, the competitions he was entering, the ideas he was developing. "Mama, I met some guys here. We're working on something together. An app idea. It's probably nothing, but it's exciting." That, probably nothing, was the beginning of everything. Josiah and 3 other students developed an application that used artificial intelligence to optimize hotel and resort management systems. It was born from Josiah's early experience watching his mother work in hospitality, understanding the inefficiencies, the wasted resources, the missed opportunities. They called it Optimize Now, and they entered it in a national technology competition for high school students. They won first place and a $50,000 prize. More importantly, they caught the attention of a venture capital firm that specialized in hospitality technology. Josiah was 16 years old when he had his first meeting with serious investors. He called his mother from the train back to school, his voice shaking with excitement. "Mama, they want to invest. Real money. They think we can turn this into an actual company." "Baby, you're still in school. How would you run a company? They said we can develop it while we finish school, then launch properly when we graduate." "Mama, this could be real. This could be something big." Nia felt a chill run down her spine. Not fear exactly, but a sense of destiny unfolding. "Then you do it, Josiah. You build your company and you show the world what you're capable of." What neither Nia nor Josiah knew was that the venture capital firm had connections throughout the hospitality industry. Optimize Now's success was being watched by industry insiders, including some who did business with the Hemsley Hotel Group. The paths that Richard thought would never cross were beginning to converge. While Josiah was building his future in Massachusetts, Richard was making the decision that would eventually destroy him. It was 2013, and Richard was feeling pressure from multiple directions. Some of his properties were underperforming. The Miami hotel he had invested in needed far more renovation than budgeted. 2 of his Caribbean resorts were facing increased competition from newer, trendier hotels. Philippe Laurent was expressing disappointment in Richard's recent returns. Victoria was spending more time in France, claiming her father needed her help with his own properties, but Richard suspected she was distancing herself from what she saw as his declining prospects. That's when Marcus Chen approached him with an opportunity. Chen was a real estate developer with projects across Asia and the Caribbean. He had a reputation for aggressive expansion and high returns. He also had a reputation for cutting corners and operating in ethical gray areas, but Richard was desperate enough to overlook that. "Richard, I'm putting together an investment group for a resort development in the Dominican Republic. Luxury eco-resort, very trendy, very profitable. I need investors who understand the high-end hospitality market. I immediately thought of you. How much investment are we talking about?" $5 million gets you a 15% stake. The projected returns are substantial. We're looking at 30 to 40% ROI within 3 years. Richard didn't have $5 million liquid. But he had properties he could leverage. He had lines of credit he hadn't fully tapped. And he had a desperate need to prove to Philippe and Victoria that he was still a major player. "I'm interested," Richard said. He should have done due diligence. He should have had lawyers review every document. He should have questioned why Chen was offering such generous terms to investors. But Richard was operating from ego and fear, never a good combination for sound business decisions. He leveraged 2 of his Caribbean properties to invest $5 million in Chen's Dominican Republic resort project. The project broke ground 6 months later. Chen sent regular updates showing construction progress. The marketing materials were glossy and impressive. Everything looked legitimate. Richard congratulated himself on his shrewd investment. He showed the projections to Victoria, who seemed pleased for the first time in months. He mentioned it casually to Philippe, who nodded approvingly. What Richard didn't know was that Marcus Chen was running a sophisticated fraud scheme. The resort was real enough, but the finances were fictional. Chen was using money from new investors to pay returns to earlier investors, a classic Ponzi structure dressed up in luxury resort clothing. Chen was also skimming massive amounts into offshore accounts, preparing for the inevitable collapse. The scheme would run for 3 more years before imploding. And when it did, it would take Richard Hemsley's empire down with it. But in 2013, Richard believed he had made a brilliant move. He believed his empire was secure. He believed Victoria loved him, or at least valued their partnership. He believed he had successfully erased the mistake of Nia and a son whose name he could never quite remember. Richard Hemsley believed he was untouchable. The universe was preparing to teach him otherwise. Back in Massachusetts, Josiah graduated from high school with perfect grades and multiple scholarship offers to top universities. He chose MIT, where he could continue developing Optimize Now while getting a world-class education in computer science and business. Nia flew up for his graduation. It was her first time leaving Jamaica, her first time on a plane, her first time seeing her son in 2 years except through video calls. When she saw Josiah walking across the stage to receive his diploma, she thought about Richard. She wondered if he knew he had a son who was graduating with honors from one of the best schools in America. She wondered if he ever thought about what he had thrown away. She hoped he didn't. She hoped Richard Hemsley lived his entire life never knowing what his son became. That seemed like a perfect punishment, somehow. Not dramatic revenge, just complete irrelevance in his son's success story. But fate had different plans. That night, at Josiah's graduation dinner, he told his mother about the next phase of Optimize Now. "We have enough funding to launch properly after I finish my first year at MIT. The market analysis shows huge potential. Hotels and resorts are desperate for better management systems. We can revolutionize the industry, Mama. I'm so proud of you, baby." Josiah reached across the table and took his mother's hands. "Mama, everything I've accomplished, it's because of you. You worked 3 jobs so I could have books. You sent me here even though it broke your heart. You never made me feel like I was less than anyone because of our situation." Nia knew he meant because of Richard. Because of being abandoned. Because of growing up without a father. "You were never less than anyone, Josiah. You were always extraordinary." One day, Josiah said, his young face serious, "I'm going to make sure you never have to work again. I'm going to buy you that house you always talked about, the one by the beach with the garden. I'm going to take care of you the way you took care of me. You don't owe me anything, baby. I owe you everything." Nia didn't know that this promise would intertwine with a justice she had stopped hoping for. She didn't know that her son's success would become the vehicle for a reckoning that would shake the entire Caribbean hospitality industry. She just knew that somehow, despite everything Richard Hemsley had done to destroy them, she and Josiah had not just survived. They were winning. And the game wasn't even close to over. Josiah Campbell graduated from MIT in 3 years instead of 4. He didn't do it to save money or because he was in a hurry. He did it because he could, because his mind worked faster than the curriculum demanded, and because Optimize Now was ready to explode into the market and he needed to be ready to lead it. By the time he walked across that graduation stage in 2017, Optimize Now had already signed pilot agreements with 12 hotel chains across North America and the Caribbean. The application did exactly what it promised. It used artificial intelligence and machine learning to optimize every aspect of hotel operations, from housekeeping schedules to inventory management to predictive maintenance. Hotels using Optimize Now saw operational costs drop by an average of 22% within the first 6 months. That kind of performance got attention in an industry where margins were everything. Josiah and his 3 co-founders moved their operations from a dorm room to a small office in Boston, then 6 months later to a larger space in Cambridge. Venture capital firms that had initially invested thousands were now offering millions for equity stakes. "We need to be careful about who we partner with," Josiah told his co-founders during a strategy meeting. "We're not just building a product. We're building a company that can dominate this industry. That means we control our growth, we control our vision, we control our destiny." At 21 years old, Josiah spoke with the authority of someone who had watched his mother fight for every scrap of dignity and success. He had learned from Nia that compromise was sometimes necessary, but surrender never was. They accepted a significant investment from Pinnacle Ventures, a firm specializing in hospitality and tourism technology. The investment valued Optimize Now at $35 million. Josiah's stake made him, on paper at least, worth $8 million. He called his mother immediately. "Mama, sit down. Baby, I'm at work, what's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong. Everything's right. Mama, we just closed our series of funding. The company is valued at $35 million. Silence on the other end. Then, $35 million. "Yes, ma'am. And Mama, my percentage means I'm worth about $8 million. We did it. We actually did it." Nia sat down in Miss Claudette's office, her legs suddenly unable to hold her. $8 million. Her son, the baby that Richard Hemsley had considered a burden worth only $500 a month, was worth $8 million. "Josiah, baby, I don't even know what to say." "Don't say anything yet. Because Mama, I made you a promise. Remember? I'm buying you that house. And I'm setting up an account for you so you never have to work for anyone else ever again unless you want to." "Baby, you don't need to." "Yes, I do. Mama, you gave me everything when you had nothing. Now I have something, and it's yours. All of it. Everything I build, it's for you." Nia cried at her desk while Miss Claudette held her hand, both women marveling at how far they had come from that desperate day 21 years ago when Nia had returned home pregnant, abandoned, and broken. Within 2 months, Josiah had purchased his mother a beautiful 4-bedroom house in a nice neighborhood in Kingston, with a garden and a view of the hills. He set up a trust fund that generated enough income that Nia could retire if she wanted to. She didn't retire. Instead, she started her own small consulting business, helping local guesthouses and small hotels improve their operations. She used everything Miss Claudette had taught her, everything she had learned from her own struggles, and she helped other people build their dreams. But she did it from her own beautiful house, on her own terms, answering to no one but herself. Pearl Campbell walked through her daughter's new home with tears streaming down her face. "Baby girl, look at what you built. Look at what you raised. That man threw you away like trash, and you turned it into triumph. Josiah did this, Mama. Not me. You did this. You raised that boy right. You taught him values. You showed him what real strength looks like. This house, this success, it's yours just as much as his. Nia stood in her new kitchen, sunlight streaming through the windows, and allowed herself to feel something she hadn't felt in over 2 decades, vindication. Not revenge, because Richard didn't even know about any of this. But vindication nonetheless. She had been told she wasn't good enough, wasn't the right class, wasn't worthy of a place in Richard's world. Now she had built her own world, and it was beautiful. While Nia was settling into her new home, Richard Hemsley's world was beginning to crumble in ways he didn't yet fully recognize. The Marcus Chin investment that had seemed so promising was showing cracks. The Dominican Republic resort was behind schedule. The updates from Chen were becoming less frequent and more vague. When Richard pressed for detailed financial reports, he received glossy summaries that looked professional but contained very little actual data. "Marcus, I need to see the actual books," Richard said during a phone call in late 2016. "My accountant is asking questions I can't answer." "Richard, my friend, you worry too much. Construction projects always run behind schedule in the Caribbean, you know that. We're still on track for profitability. I'm sending over the Q3 reports next week." The reports arrived, and they looked fine on the surface. But Richard's accountant, a sharp woman named Dorothy Chen, no relation to Marcus, saw red flags immediately. "Mr. Hemsley, these numbers don't add up. The construction costs are inconsistent with market rates. The timeline doesn't match the progress photos. And I can't verify any of the contractor information they've provided." "What are you saying, Dorothy?" "I'm saying I think you should hire a forensic accountant to audit this investment. I'm saying something feels wrong." Richard felt ice in his stomach. $5 million. He had leveraged 2 properties for that investment. If something was wrong, if Chen was running some kind of scheme, Richard could lose everything he had built. "Do the audit," he said quietly. Quietly. "I don't want this getting out until we know what we're dealing with." The audit took 3 months. The results were devastating. Marcus Chen's Dominican Republic resort was a sophisticated fraud. The construction was real but minimal, worth maybe 20% of what had been reported to investors. The rest of the money had been moved through a series of shell companies and offshore accounts. Chen had been running a Ponzi scheme, using new investor money to pay returns to earlier investors while siphoning the majority into accounts in the Cayman Islands and Singapore. Richard was one of over 40 investors who had been defrauded. The total fraud was estimated at over $200 million. When the scheme collapsed in early 2017, it made international news. Marcus Chen disappeared, presumably to a country without extradition treaties. Investors were left holding worthless equity in a half-built resort that would never open. Richard lost his $5 million investment. Worse, the 2 properties he had leveraged were now at risk. The banks wanted their money, and Richard didn't have it. He met with his financial team in a conference room that suddenly felt suffocating. "How bad is it?" he asked. Dorothy laid it out clinically. "If you liquidate the Barbados property, you can cover the debt on the Trinidad property and keep it. But you'll need to sell Barbados quickly, which means accepting less than market value. Alternatively, you could try to refinance both properties, but given the fraud scandal and your current debt-to-asset ratio, I don't think any bank will approve the terms you'd need." "What about the other properties?" "The other properties are performing adequately, but several are mortgaged close to their maximum values. You've been leveraging assets to fund expansion for years, Mr. Hemsley. There's very little equity cushion left." Richard felt the walls closing in. "What do I tell Victoria? What do I tell her father?" Dorothy looked at him with something like pity. "You tell them the truth. And you hope they're willing to help. Richard told Victoria that night. They were in their Montego Bay home, the villa that had once belonged to Richard alone, the villa where Nia had lived briefly before being discarded. Victoria listened to his explanation with an expression that grew colder with each sentence. "You invested $5 million without consulting me," she said when he finished. "It was my money, for my properties. We're married, Richard. It's our money. Our properties. Or have you forgotten that the only reason your little Caribbean hotel chain became anything significant was because of my family's connections?" There it was. The truth that had always lurked beneath their marriage, now spoken plainly. Richard wasn't Victoria's partner. He was her project, and projects that failed got abandoned. "Victoria, I need to know if your father would consider helping. A loan, or perhaps taking equity in some of the properties in exchange for." "My father doesn't throw good money after bad, Richard. He's a businessman, not a charity. If you've made foolish investments, you'll have to extract yourself. I thought we were a team." Victoria laughed, a cold sound without humor. "We're a team when you're successful. When you're a liability, you're on your own. Surely you understand that concept. Wasn't that your philosophy with that Jamaican woman you were married to? When she became inconvenient, you discarded her." The words hit Richard like a slap. He hadn't thought about Nia in years. She existed in his mind only as a mistake from his past, if she existed at all. That was completely different. That was you making a calculated decision about who served your interests. I'm making the same calculation, darling. And right now, you're looking like a very poor investment. Victoria left for France the next week. She said it was to visit her father, but Richard knew she was distancing herself from his financial disaster. Philippe Laurent had been making disapproving noises about Richard's lack of judgment regarding the Chen investment. Richard sold the Barbados property at a significant loss. It broke his heart. That property had been part of his father's original 3 hotels, part of his inheritance, part of his identity as a Hemsley. But it was either sell it or lose both it and the Trinidad property to the banks. The sale kept him afloat, but barely. The Hemsley Hotel Group, once expanding and prestigious, was now contracting and vulnerable. Industry insiders were whispering about Richard's financial problems. Some of his management contracts were not being renewed. Investors were pulling back from proposed partnerships. Richard's reputation, which he had valued above almost everything, was crumbling. And Victoria was in France, taking calls from Richard less and less frequently, making excuses about why she couldn't return to Jamaica. Richard's business manager, a longtime employee named Trevor Banks, tried to be optimistic. "Mr. Hemsley, the industry is changing anyway. These big traditional hotel groups are facing competition from boutique brands and tech-enabled booking platforms. What you need is to modernize, to adopt new management systems that can cut costs and improve efficiency." "Like what?" "There are these new AI-powered management applications. I've been reading about one called Optimize now that's getting incredible results. Hotels using it are cutting operational costs by 20% or more." Richard barely paid attention. He was too focused on keeping his remaining properties afloat and trying to salvage his marriage. He didn't know that the application Trevor was recommending had been created by his son. He didn't know that Josiah Campbell, the baby he had discarded 21 years ago, was building a hospitality technology empire that would soon dwarf Richard's entire hotel chain. The paths were converging, but Richard was still blind to it. In Boston, Josiah was navigating his own challenges. Success brought pressure. Optimize now had grown from 4 co-founders to a company with 85 employees. Major hotel chains were implementing their system. The company was being valued at over $100 million. Josiah's co-founders wanted to sell to a larger tech company and cash out. Josiah wanted to keep building, to expand into resort management, to dominate the entire hospitality technology sector. "Josiah, we've got an offer from Tech Global for $120 million, his co-founder Derek said. "That's $30 million each for us. We're 21 years old, man. We could retire." "I don't want to retire. I want to build something that matters. Something that lasts. This is generational wealth we're talking about. My mother raised me on nothing. On $500 a month child support from a father who wanted nothing to do with me. And she gave me everything. I'm not building this for money, Derek. I'm building it to prove something." "Prove what?" Josiah didn't answer directly. How could he explain that every success felt like vindication for his mother? How could he explain that he was driven by the ghost of a father he had never met, a father who had decided Josiah wasn't worth knowing? "I'm building it because I can," Josiah finally said. "And because stopping now feels like quitting." They compromised. Optimize Now would stay independent, but they would bring in experienced executives to help scale the company. They would open an office in the Caribbean to better serve that market. And they would develop new products beyond the core management system. Josiah moved to Jamaica for 6 months to oversee the Caribbean expansion. It was the first time he had lived in his birth country since he was 14 years old. Nia was overjoyed to have her son close again, even temporarily. They had dinner together several times a week. She watched with pride as Josiah led meetings, negotiated contracts, and built relationships with hotel owners across the Caribbean. "You're a natural leader, baby," she said one evening. "I learned from the best," Josiah replied. "Mama, you ran a household on almost nothing, put me through school, worked 3 jobs, and never once made me feel like we were struggling. That's leadership. I did what I had to do. You did more than that. You showed me that where you come from doesn't determine where you're going." One afternoon, Josiah was reviewing potential clients for Optimize Now's Caribbean expansion when he saw a familiar name on the list, Hemsley Hotel Group. He stared at that name for a long time. Hemsley. His father's name. The name he had never been allowed to carry. "Who owns this company?" he asked his Caribbean operations manager. "Richard Hemsley. British guy, been operating luxury hotels in the Caribbean for decades." "Why?" "Just curious." "What's their financial situation?" "Honestly, not great. They were hit hard by that Marcus Chin fraud scandal. Lost a major property. Word is they're struggling to keep up with the new competition. They need modernization badly." Josiah felt something cold and sharp in his chest. His father's company was failing. The empire built on luxury and prestige was crumbling. And Josiah had the power to save it or let it die. He didn't tell his mother about seeing Richard's name on the client list. He didn't tell anyone. He just filed the information away and continued building Optimize Now into something powerful enough that when the time came, whatever he decided would matter. Back in Montego Bay, Richard was dealing with another crisis. Victoria had been in France for 3 months. She was taking his calls less frequently. When they did talk, she was distant, distracted. Richard flew to Nice to see her. She met him at a cafe, not at her father's estate where he was clearly not welcome. "Victoria, we need to talk about our marriage." "What marriage, Richard?" "I'm in France. You're in Jamaica. We speak maybe once a week. We haven't been intimate in over a year. We're business partners who share a last name, nothing more. It doesn't have to be that way. Actually, it does. Because Richard, I've moved on. There's someone else. Someone my father approves of, someone with actual prospects. Richard felt like he had been punched. Who? Does it matter? Richard, our marriage served its purpose for a while. You got access to my father's network. I got the adventure of the Caribbean hotel lifestyle. But you've stalled, and I'm bored, and my father thinks you're a liability. It's time to end this. I won't give you a divorce. Then I'll take one. Richard, I've already consulted with lawyers. French lawyers, who are very good at protecting French interests. I'm entitled to half of everything acquired during our marriage. I'm choosing to be generous and only take 3 properties and a settlement. Sign the papers, or I'll take far more and drag this through courts for years. Richard realized with stunning clarity that Victoria was exactly what he had been to Nia 21 years ago. She was discarding him because he was no longer useful. She was trading up to a better option. She was erasing him from her life with the same cold calculation he had used on his first wife. Karma, it seemed, had a vicious sense of irony. Which 3 properties? He asked, his voice hollow. The nice property, obviously. The Martinique property. And I think the Trinidad property. The one you managed to keep after selling off your precious Barbados inheritance. She was taking the Trinidad property. The last piece of his father's original 3 hotels. She was stripping him of his heritage as casually as ordering lunch. Victoria, please. Not Trinidad. Take one of the newer properties. Take anything else. No. I want Trinidad. Sign the papers, Richard. He signed. What choice did he have? Fighting would cost money he didn't have and drag his reputation through more mud. Victoria Laurent became Victoria Laurent again, no longer a Hemsley, walking away with 3 properties worth millions and leaving Richard with a diminished empire and a thoroughly broken spirit. Richard was now 55 years old, divorced for the 2nd time, and watching everything he had built slip away. He sat alone in his Montego Bay villa, the same villa where he had once told Nia she wasn't good enough for his world, and he wondered how his life had gone so wrong. He never thought about the child he had abandoned. He never wondered if that monthly child support was still being sent automatically by his accountant. He never considered that the baby he had deemed worthless might have grown into someone significant. Richard Hemsley was too focused on his own downfall to imagine that his greatest reckoning was still ahead of him. And that reckoning had his mother's eyes and a mind sharp enough to dismantle everything Richard had left. The divorce from Victoria finalized in late 2018. Richard lost 3 properties, paid a settlement that drained his reserves, and discovered something that shattered what little dignity he had left. Victoria had been cheating on him for 2 years. Not with just anyone, but with Philippe Laurent's business partner, a French hotel magnate named Alexander Dubois. They had been planning their future together while Victoria was still wearing Richard's ring. The revelation came from Christopher Dane, Richard's old friend, who called him one evening with obvious reluctance in his voice. "Richard, I thought you should know before you see it in the trades. Victoria and Alexander just announced a merger between their families' hotel groups. The press release mentions they've been working on this partnership for over 2 years. 2 years. While Richard was fighting to save his investments, Victoria was building her exit strategy with another man. There's more," Christopher continued. "The announcement mentions their upcoming wedding. They're calling it a unification of 2 great hospitality legacies." Richard hung up and poured himself a drink with shaking hands. Then another. Then several more. He had done this exact thing to Nia. Moved on to Victoria while still with his first wife, planned his future with someone else while pretending his marriage still mattered. He had discarded Nia without a second thought. Now he understood how it felt to be the one discarded. But the devastation wasn't finished. His accountant Dorothy called him into her office 2 weeks later. Her expression told him it was bad news before she said a word. Mr. Hemsley, we have a serious problem. I've been reviewing the finances from your marriage to Victoria, and there are significant discrepancies. What kind of discrepancies? Money that should have been in joint accounts has been moved. Victoria had signing authority on several business accounts. Over the past 3 years, approximately $2 million has been transferred out in small increments that individually didn't trigger alerts, but cumulatively represent major theft. Can we get it back? She's in France. The money is in French accounts. You'd have to sue in French courts, which would cost hundreds of thousands with no guarantee of success. And frankly, you can't afford the legal fees. Richard felt the room spin. Victoria hadn't just left him. She had systematically robbed him while planning her escape. How bad is my financial situation? Tell me the truth. Dorothy laid out a spreadsheet that showed Richard's empire in stark numbers. After the divorce, after the Chen fraud losses, after Victoria's theft, Richard Hemsley owned 4 properties. 3 were mortgaged heavily. 1, the original Montego Bay Hotel, was clear but desperately needed renovation he couldn't afford. You're not bankrupt yet, but you're close. One more significant loss and the whole structure collapses. That loss came 3 months later. A hurricane swept through the Caribbean in September 2019, causing significant damage to 2 of Richard's properties. The insurance covered some of it, but Richard had reduced his coverage years ago to save money. The out-of-pocket repairs would cost nearly $1 million he didn't have. He tried to get loans. Banks that had once courted his business now politely declined. His credit was overextended. His assets were overleveraged. He was, in banking terms, a bad risk. Richard laid off half his staff. He cut services at his hotels to bare minimum. He stopped returning calls from industry colleagues because he couldn't bear their pity. The Hemsley Hotel Group, once a respected name in Caribbean luxury hospitality, became known as a fading brand desperately clinging to past glory. Richard was 57 years old and facing ruin. One evening, drinking alone in his villa, he found himself thinking about his father. The old man had built the original 3 hotels through hard work and careful management. He had entrusted them to Richard, believing his son would expand the legacy. Richard had destroyed it. Through arrogance, through greed, through trusting the wrong people and making reckless decisions. His phone rang. It was Trevor Banks, his business manager. Mr. Hemsley, I have a potential solution. There's a company that specializes in rescuing struggling hotel groups. They provide capital investment in exchange for equity and management input. It could keep you afloat. What company? They're called Hospitality Solutions International. They're relatively new but very well funded. They've turned around several struggling properties in the Caribbean and Central America. How much equity would they want? That would be negotiated. But Mr. Hemsley, you don't have many options. You either bring in a partner or you start liquidating properties. Richard agreed to a meeting. 2 weeks later, representatives from Hospitality Solutions International arrived at Richard's Montego Bay Hotel. There were 3 of them, 2 lawyers and a lead negotiator who introduced himself as David Chen. No relation to Marcus Chen, David assured him immediately. They spent 2 days reviewing Richard's properties, his finances, his operational structure. They were thorough and professional, asking questions that showed deep industry knowledge. On the 3rd day, they made their offer. Mr. Hemsley, we're prepared to invest $5 million in immediate capital for property repairs and operational improvements. In exchange, we would acquire a 60% stake in the Hemsley Hotel Group and install our own management team. 60%. Richard would become a minority owner in his own company. That's more than half, Richard said. That's proportional to the risk we're taking. Mr. Hemsley, your company is on the verge of bankruptcy. We're offering you a chance to save it and retain some ownership. The alternative is losing everything. I need time to think. You have 48 hours. After that, the offer is withdrawn and we pursue other opportunities. Richard consulted with Dorothy, with Trevor, with the few business associates who still took his calls. They all said the same thing: take the deal. He was signing the papers when something made him ask, who owns Hospitality Solutions International? Who are the principals? David Chen smiled. The company is privately held by a consortium of investors. The primary stakeholder prefers to remain anonymous for now, but I can assure you they have deep expertise in hospitality and significant financial resources. Richard signed. He had no choice. Within a week, new management arrived at his properties. They were efficient, knowledgeable, and had clear mandates to modernize operations. They implemented new systems, including an AI-powered management platform that Richard vaguely recognized as something Trevor had mentioned before. Optimize Now. That was the name. The new management team reported to someone they referred to only as the principal investor. Richard never met this person. All major decisions came through David Chen, who was unfailingly polite but firm. Richard's role became largely ceremonial. He maintained an office and his title, but he had no real power. The company his father had built, that had carried the Hemsley name for over 50 years, was now controlled by anonymous investors who made decisions without consulting him. It was humiliating. But it was better than bankruptcy. What Richard didn't know was that the anonymous principal investor was watching every move. Studying Richard's properties, his management style, his history. Learning everything about the man who had abandoned a wife and child 23 years ago. Josiah Campbell had acquired controlling interest in his father's company, and Richard Hemsley had no idea he was now working for his own son. The irony was exquisite. Justice was building. And the revelation, when it came, would destroy everything Richard thought he knew about his life. But for now, Josiah waited. He wanted his father comfortable, complacent, dependent on the lifeline that had been thrown to him. Because the best revenge isn't served hot or cold. It's served at exactly the moment when it will hurt the most. And that moment was coming. The new management team wasted no time transforming Richard's properties. Within 6 months, they had renovated 2 hotels, modernized all systems, and increased occupancy rates across the board. The Hemsley Hotel Group was profitable again. Richard should have been relieved. Instead, he felt like a ghost in his own company. The management team was polite but dismissive. They held meetings without inviting him. They made decisions about properties he had owned for decades and informed him after the fact. When he objected, David Chen would smile pleasantly and remind him that the 60% stakeholder had final authority on operational matters. You're still the face of the company, Mr. Hemsley. You still have your title. But the day-to-day operations are our responsibility now. Richard's office became a prison. He would sit there for hours with nothing to do, watching strangers run the company his father had built. Staff who had worked for him for years now reported to other people. His opinions were solicited out of courtesy, then politely ignored. The villa in Montego Bay, his last vestige of the luxury he had once taken for granted, became harder to maintain. The divorce settlement and his reduced income meant he could no longer afford the full staff. He let go of the housekeeper, the gardener, the cook. He lived alone in a house too big for one person, rooms collecting dust, the pool turning green because he couldn't afford regular maintenance. He was 60 years old and felt ancient. Christopher Dane visited one afternoon and barely hid his shock at Richard's appearance. Jesus, Richard. When did you last eat a proper meal? I eat. I'm fine. You're not fine. You've lost weight. This place looks like it's falling apart. Talk to me. What's happening? Richard laughed bitterly. What's happening is I'm reaping what I sowed, apparently. You remember what I did to Nia? How I threw her out and moved on without a second thought. That was decades ago. Karma doesn't have an expiration date, Chris. Victoria did the same thing to me. Now these anonymous investors have taken my company and turned me into a figurehead. I own 40% of a company I no longer control. I live in a house I can barely maintain. I have no wife, no friends except you, no purpose. What about your son? The one from your first marriage? Richard looked at Christopher blankly. What son? The baby. Nia's baby. You had a child, Richard. I have a financial obligation that gets paid monthly. Beyond that, I haven't thought about it in years. He'd be what, 23, 24 now? Could be anywhere, doing anything. Probably hates me, if he even knows I exist. Christopher shook his head. You never even tried to find out what happened to them. Why would I? That was a different life. A mistake I paid for and moved on from. Except you didn't move on, did you? You just replaced one wife with another, and she destroyed you worse than you destroyed the first one. The words stung because they were true. Richard poured himself a drink, his hands shaking slightly. I know what I did, Chris. I know I was a bastard. But what good does regret do me now? That kid is better off not knowing me. At least I gave him child support. I met my obligation. You gave him money. That's not the same as meeting your obligation as a father. Christopher left shortly after, and Richard sat alone in his decaying villa, thinking about the son whose name he couldn't remember. Josiah? Joseph? Something biblical, he thought. Nia had chosen the name without consulting him. He wondered briefly what the boy had become. Then he poured another drink and pushed the thought away. The descent accelerated. Richard's doctor told him his liver was showing signs of damage from drinking. His blood pressure was dangerously high. He needed to make lifestyle changes or he was heading for a heart attack or stroke. Richard nodded and ignored the advice. The villa's roof started leaking during rainy season. Richard called a contractor who quoted him $15,000 for repairs. Richard didn't have $15,000. He put buckets under the leaks and tried not to think about the water damage accumulating in the walls. His car broke down. The repair would cost $3,000. Richard sold the car and started using taxis, another small humiliation in a growing list. He stopped going to industry events because he couldn't bear the pity in people's eyes. Richard Hemsley, who had once been courted by investors and featured in magazines, was now a cautionary tale. The man who had it all and lost it through bad decisions and worse luck. Then David Chin called him into the office for a meeting. Mr. Hemsley, the principal investor would like to make some changes to the corporate structure. What kind of changes? We're rebranding. The Hemsley Hotel Group will become part of a larger portfolio under a new parent company. Your properties will be absorbed into the larger brand. You're removing my name. We're evolving the business model. The Hemsley name will still be honored in the company history, but moving forward, we need a brand that reflects our expanded vision. They were erasing him. Just as he had erased Nia from his life, these investors were erasing him from the company that bore his family name. I want to meet this principal investor. I have a right to know who's making these decisions. That's not possible at this time. The principal investor values privacy and operates through designated representatives. I own 40%. I should at least know who owns the other 60%. David Chen's smile was pleasant and immovable. Your shares are minority non-voting shares, Mr. Hemsley. As outlined in the agreement you signed. You're entitled to your percentage of profits, but you have no voting rights on operational decisions. Richard had been so desperate when he signed that agreement. He hadn't read it carefully. Hadn't understood what non-voting shares meant in practical terms. It meant he owned 40% of nothing that mattered. When does the rebrand happen? The announcement goes out next month. We wanted to inform you as a courtesy. A courtesy. They were destroying his family legacy as a courtesy. Richard went home and got drunk. Not the pleasant buzz of social drinking, but the obliterating darkness of someone trying to escape reality. He woke up on his bathroom floor at 3 a.m, vomit on his shirt, his head pounding. This was rock bottom. This was what happened when you built your life on image and wealth and prestige instead of character and relationships and love. He thought about Nia again. Wondered if she ever thought about him. Wondered if she knew how thoroughly his life had fallen apart. Wondered if she would feel vindicated or just indifferent. He hoped she had found happiness. He hoped she had moved on and built a good life. At least one of them deserved it. What Richard didn't know was that Nia was living in a beautiful house in Kingston, running a successful consulting business, proud mother of a son who was revolutionizing the hospitality industry. What Richard didn't know was that his son now controlled his company and was systematically stripping away everything Richard had, not out of cruelty, but out of justice. What Richard didn't know was that his reckoning was scheduled for 3 months from now, at a charity gala celebrating the Caribbean hospitality industry. The principal investor had decided it was time for a face-to-face meeting. And when Richard Hemsley finally learned the truth about who had saved and then conquered his company, it would shatter what little remained of his world. The invitation arrived on embossed cardstock, delivered by courier to Richard's deteriorating villa. The Caribbean Hospitality Excellence Gala. Celebrating innovation and leadership in island tourism. Montego Bay Convention Center. Black tie required. Richard almost threw it away. He hadn't attended industry events in over a year. The thought of facing former colleagues, enduring their pity or worse their indifference, made him physically ill. But something in the invitation caught his eye. The gala was honoring emerging leaders who are transforming Caribbean hospitality through technology and innovation. One of the keynote speakers was listed as Principal Leadership, Hospitality Solutions International. The mysterious investor who controlled his company would be there. Would be speaking publicly. Richard could finally know who had taken everything from him. He called David Chen. The gala invitation. Will the principal investor actually be there? Yes, Mr. Hemsley. This will be their first public appearance. They've specifically requested that all HSI stakeholders attend. Including me. Especially you. Consider it mandatory. Richard hung up, his heart pounding. He could refuse. He could stay home, avoid the humiliation of attending an industry event as a has-been, a cautionary tale. But the need to know, to finally see who had systematically dismantled his empire while saving it, was overwhelming. He would go. He would face whatever waited for him there. The decision made, Richard realized he had another problem. The invitation specified black tie. His tuxedo was 15 years old and no longer fit his thinner frame. He couldn't afford a new one. He ended up renting one, another small humiliation. Richard Hemsley, who had once owned a dozen custom suits, renting formal wear like a college student going to prom. What Richard didn't know was that across Kingston, in Nia's beautiful house, a very different conversation was happening. Josiah had come to visit his mother, his expression serious in a way that made Nia concerned. "Mama, I need to tell you something. About my company. Is everything okay? Is the business in trouble?" "No, the business is doing better than ever. Mama, you know we expanded into property investment and management, right?" "Yes, baby. You told me about that." Josiah took a deep breath. We acquired a controlling stake in a struggling hotel group about 18 months ago. We've been turning it around, modernizing the properties, improving operations. That's wonderful. Why do you look so serious? Because the company we acquired is the Hemsley Hotel Group. The silence in the room was absolute. Nia stared at her son, trying to process what he had just said. Hemsley. Richard Hemsley? Yes, Mama. I own 60% of my father's company. I've been running his hotels for a year and a half. He has no idea who I am. Nia sat down heavily. Why? Why would you do this? It started as a business decision. The company was failing, the assets were good, the price was right. But Mama, I'd be lying if I said that's all it was. When I saw his name, when I realized I could buy his company, control his legacy, I wanted to. Is that wrong? Nia looked at her son, this brilliant man she had raised alone. What are you planning to do? There's a gala next month. I'm being honored for innovation in hospitality technology. I'm going to speak, and I'm going to reveal who owns HSI. He'll be there. I've made sure of it. You're going to tell him. Publicly. He needs to know that the son he threw away is the reason he still has anything at all. He needs to face what he did. Nia's emotions were complicated. Part of her wanted Richard to face consequences. Part of her worried about her son carrying this anger. Baby, I need to ask you something. Are you doing this for justice or for revenge? Josiah was quiet for a long moment. I don't know, Mama. Maybe both. Does it matter? It matters because revenge will eat at you. Justice is about truth. Revenge is about hurt. I need to know which one is driving you. He abandoned us, Mama. He threw you out when you were pregnant. He never once asked about me, never tried to know me. Don't you want him to know what he missed? Don't you want him to see what we became despite him? Of course I do. But baby, I also want you to be at peace. I don't want his rejection to define your success. You built your company because you're brilliant and driven. Not because of him. I know that. But Mama, he's going to be sitting in that ballroom thinking he's entitled to respect, thinking his name still means something. I want him to know the truth. Nia reached for her son's hand. Then tell him the truth. But do it from strength, not from pain. Don't let him have power over you, even now. Will you come with me? To the gala? Nia's breath caught. Face Richard after 24 years. See the man who had destroyed her world and then disappeared from it. I don't know if I can. Mama, you raised me alone. You worked yourself to exhaustion to give me opportunities. You never badmouthed him, never made me feel less than. You deserve to be there when the truth comes out. You deserve to see his face when he realizes what he threw away. Nia thought about the scared 24-year-old girl she had been, signing papers with shaking hands, leaving the villa with her dignity in tatters. She thought about the years of struggle, the whispered gossip, the humiliation. She thought about the beautiful life she had built anyway. Okay, she said. I'll come with you. Josiah hugged his mother. Thank you. For everything. For raising me right. For never giving up. This moment, it's for both of us. The weeks before the gala passed in a blur of preparation. Josiah worked with his team to prepare his speech. He had copies made of documents he wanted to share, the divorce papers Richard had forced Nia to sign, the paternity acknowledgement, the child support payment records. He wasn't going to just tell the story. He was going to prove it. David Chin tried to talk him out of the public revelation. Josiah, I understand your feelings, but this is a professional event. Making it personal could damage your reputation. My reputation is built on innovation and results. The personal story just adds context. People need to know that success can come from anywhere, even from the children that powerful men discard. Meanwhile, Richard was preparing in his own way. He had the rented tuxedo altered to fit better. He practiced expressions in the mirror, trying to look dignified instead of desperate. He told himself he was just going to observe, to finally see who controlled his fate. He would be professional, courteous, accept his diminished role with grace. What else could he do? The night before the gala, Richard stood in his villa looking at old photographs. There was one of him and his father at the opening of the original Montego Bay Hotel. His father looked proud, confident in his son's ability to carry on the legacy. "I'm sorry, Dad," Richard whispered to the photograph. "I destroyed everything you built." In Kingston, Nia was trying on the dress Josiah had bought for her. It was elegant, expensive, beautiful. She looked at herself in the mirror and barely recognized the confident woman staring back. She wasn't that broken girl anymore. She was a successful businesswoman, a proud mother, a survivor who had turned pain into purpose. Tomorrow, Richard Hemsley would see exactly what he had thrown away. Tomorrow, the son he never wanted would reveal himself as the man who now controlled everything Richard had left. Tomorrow, justice would finally have its day. The Montego Bay Convention Center glittered with the wealth and power of Caribbean hospitality. Hotel owners, investors, tourism officials, and industry leaders filled the grand ballroom. Champagne flowed. Jazz played softly. The atmosphere buzzed with networking and deal-making. Richard Hemsley arrived alone in a taxi, his rented tuxedo fitting well enough but feeling like a costume. He checked in at the registration desk, received his name tag, and entered the ballroom where he had once been a respected figure. A few people nodded politely. Most didn't acknowledge him at all. Richard found a seat at a table near the back, far from the front where industry leaders sat. He ordered a drink and waited. The program began with welcome remarks from the tourism minister. Then awards for various categories: Best New Resort, Most Sustainable Property, Excellence in Customer Service. Richard barely paid attention. He was scanning the room, trying to guess which person might be the mysterious principal investor. Then he saw her. She was seated at a front table, wearing an elegant navy dress, her hair styled beautifully. She was older, but unmistakable. The shape of her face, the way she held herself, the graceful way she moved when she turned to speak to someone. Nia. Richard's drink slipped from his hand, splashing on the table. His heart hammered. What was she doing here? After 24 years, why was she at this event? He watched as she laughed at something her companion said. She looked happy, healthy, successful. Nothing like the devastated young woman he had thrown out of his villa. She was sitting at a front table. The tables reserved for honored guests and major industry players. How? The master of ceremonies returned to the podium. Ladies and gentlemen, it's now my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker. At just 28 years old, he has revolutionized hospitality management through artificial intelligence and innovative technology. His company, Optimize Now, is used by over 300 hotels worldwide. He has recently expanded into property acquisition and management through Hospitality Solutions International. Please welcome Josiah Campbell. The room erupted in applause. Richard watched a young man walk confidently to the podium. He was tall, well-built, impeccably dressed. Professional. Powerful. Commanding attention without demanding it. Campbell. Nia's maiden name. The young man reached the podium and smiled at the audience. When his eyes swept the room, Richard felt a chill. Those eyes were hazel. Unusual. Striking. Familiar. Thank you, Josiah began, his voice clear and strong. It's an honor to be here tonight among so many industry leaders. Many of you use Optimize now in your properties. You've seen how technology can transform operations, reduce costs, improve guest experiences. That's been my mission since I started coding as a teenager: make hospitality better through innovation. The audience applauded. Josiah waited for silence. But tonight, I want to talk about a different kind of transformation. The personal kind. Because my journey in this industry didn't start in a boardroom or a tech incubator. It started in a small guest house in Kingston, where my mother worked multiple jobs to give me opportunities she never had. Richard's hands gripped the table edge. His mind was racing, refusing to connect dots that were becoming impossible to ignore. My mother, Nia Campbell, is here tonight. Josiah gestured to Nia, who stood briefly. The audience applauded. She raised me alone after my father decided we weren't good enough for his world. She was 24 years old, pregnant, and discarded by a man who valued social status over human dignity. The room had gone completely quiet. This wasn't the usual industry keynote. My father was a hotel owner. When he married my mother, she was working in hospitality, trying to build a career. But she came from a humble background. She wasn't from the right social class. So when she got pregnant, he decided to upgrade. He divorced my mother and married a European socialite who could help him expand his empire. Richard couldn't breathe. The room was spinning. He gave my mother a settlement and $500 a month in child support. Then he erased us from his life completely. He never called to check on us. Never asked about his son. Never wondered if the baby he threw away might become something. Josiah's voice remained calm, controlled, but the emotion underneath was clear. That baby grew up in a small house in Kingston. He went to school on scholarships. He learned to code on borrowed computers. He got into MIT and started a company that is now valued at over $200 million. Gasps rippled through the audience. People were turning to each other, whispering. 18 months ago, my company acquired a struggling hotel group. The owner had made bad investments, lost properties in a divorce, and was facing bankruptcy. We offered him a lifeline. 60% equity in exchange for $5 million in capital and new management. Richard stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly. People turned to look at him. Josiah's eyes locked on his father's face. That owner is here tonight. Richard Hemsley, would you please stand? Richard was already standing, frozen, unable to move or speak. Mr. Hemsley is my father. The man who abandoned my mother and me 28 years ago. The man who decided I wasn't worth knowing. The ballroom erupted in shocked murmurs. Heads turned to stare at Richard. Some expressions showed pity, others showed contempt. For the past 18 months, my father has been working in the company I now control. Taking decisions from my management team. Accepting the lifeline I threw him. Never knowing that the anonymous investor who saved his failing empire was the son he threw away. Josiah pulled papers from the podium. I have documentation here. The divorce papers my father forced my mother to sign, including clauses stating she misrepresented her social standing. The paternity acknowledgement. 28 years of child support payment records, $500 a month, every month, the only acknowledgement that I existed. He looked directly at Richard. I didn't have to save your company, Mr. Hemsley. I could have let it collapse. But I wanted you to face this moment. I wanted you to know that the baby you deemed worthless now controls everything you have left. I wanted you to understand what you threw away. Richard tried to speak, but no words came out. His legs felt weak. The entire industry was watching him, judging him, seeing the truth of what he had done. Mama, please stand up, Josiah said. Nia stood, graceful and dignified. The transformation from the young woman Richard had discarded was complete. This woman raised me with dignity and love. She worked herself to exhaustion to give me opportunities. She never spoke badly about you, even though you deserved it. She taught me that where you come from doesn't determine where you're going. Everything I am, everything I've built, is because of her strength. The audience began to applaud. It started with a few people, then spread through the entire ballroom. A standing ovation for Nia, for surviving, for raising an extraordinary son despite impossible odds. Richard watched, humiliated, devastated, unable to look away. I'm not telling this story for sympathy, Josiah continued when the applause died down. I'm telling it because people need to know that success can come from anywhere. From the children that powerful men discard. From the women they humiliate and throw away. From the people they deem beneath their social status. He paused, letting the words sink in. Mr. Hemsley, you made a choice 28 years ago. You chose status over character. Image over integrity. You thought you were trading up when you married into European hotel royalty. How did that work out for you? The cruelty of the question hung in the air. Everyone in the room knew about Richard's divorce from Victoria, about the properties he lost, about his fall from grace. I could destroy what's left of your company, Josiah said quietly. I could force you out completely, take your name off the buildings, erase you the way you erased us. But I'm not going to do that. Richard's head jerked up. Hope and confusion on his face. I'm not going to destroy you because I'm not you. I don't discard people because they're no longer useful. The Hemsley Hotel Group will continue operating. Your name will remain on the original Montego Bay property as a historical acknowledgement. You'll continue receiving your 40% profit share. Josiah's expression was unreadable. But you need to understand something. You don't control your legacy anymore. I do. The son you never wanted is now the only reason your father's name means anything in this industry. He gathered his papers and stepped back from the podium. That's all I have to say. Thank you for your time. The audience didn't know how to react. Some applauded cautiously. Others sat in stunned silence. The master of ceremonies stumbled through a transition to the next segment. Richard stood at his table, every eye in the room on him. He saw pity, disgust, fascination, contempt. He saw his entire reputation, already damaged, now completely destroyed. He turned and walked out of the ballroom. He needed air. He needed to think. He needed to process what had just happened. He made it to the lobby before his legs gave out. He sat heavily on a bench, his head in his hands. Footsteps approached. He looked up. Nia stood in front of him, elegant and composed. Up close, he could see the woman he had married in her face, but transformed by time and strength into someone he barely recognized. Nia, he whispered. Richard. I don't know what to say. There's nothing to say. You made your choices. Josiah and I made ours. We survived. We thrived. You don't get credit for that, and you don't get to apologize away 28 years of absence. He's extraordinary. Your son. Our son. My son, Nia corrected firmly. You contributed DNA and $500 a month. I contributed everything else. Richard nodded, unable to argue. I hope you heard what he said in there, Nia continued. He's not destroying you because I raised him better than that. I raised him to be strong without being cruel. Successful without being arrogant. Powerful without being destructive. Everything you weren't. She turned to leave, then paused. You know what the saddest part is, Richard? If you had just been decent, if you had just treated us with basic human respect, you could have known him. You could have watched him grow into this amazing person. You could have been proud. Instead, you threw us away for a woman who did the same thing to you. You got exactly what you deserved. Nia walked away, back straight, head high. Richard sat alone in the lobby while the gala continued without him. He had lost everything. His company, his reputation, his dignity. And he had just discovered that the son he never knew had become more successful, more powerful, more respected than Richard had ever been. The supreme irony was that Josiah had saved him. The son he abandoned had given him a lifeline when no one else would. Richard Hemsley finally understood what it meant to reap what you sow. And the harvest was bitter beyond measure. The story of what happened at the Caribbean Hospitality Excellence Gala spread like wildfire through the industry. Within 24 hours, it was being discussed on hospitality blogs, trade publications, and social media. The son who came back to save the father who abandoned him became an international story. Some people saw Josiah as vindictive. Most saw him as a symbol of justice and resilience. Richard Hemsley became the cautionary tale he had always feared, the man who threw away his family and lost everything that mattered. 3 days after the gala, Richard received a letter delivered by courier. It was from Josiah's legal team, outlining the terms of Richard's continued involvement with the Hemsley Hotel Group. He would retain his 40% non-voting shares. He would receive quarterly profit distributions. His name would remain on the original Montego Bay property with a plaque acknowledging his father's founding legacy. But he would have no operational role, no decision-making authority, and no public representation of the company. Essentially, he was a silent partner in his own former empire. The letter included one additional clause: Mr. Hemsley is welcome to request a private meeting with Josiah Campbell at any time to discuss family matters separate from business operations. Such meetings are at Mr. Campbell's discretion and availability. Richard stared at that paragraph for a long time. His son was offering him a chance. Not reconciliation exactly, but an opening. A possibility. Richard wasn't sure he deserved it. Wasn't sure he could face Josiah one-on-one after the public humiliation. But the offer existed, and that meant something. He called the number provided and left a brief message with Josiah's assistant: "Please tell Mr. Campbell that his father would like to meet, at his convenience, whenever he's ready. I'll wait." That was all Richard could do. Wait and hope. Meanwhile, Josiah was navigating his own complicated feelings. The confrontation at the gala had been satisfying in the moment, but afterward, he felt hollow. Vindicated but not exactly happy. He talked to his mother about it over dinner at her house. "I thought exposing him would feel better than this," Josiah admitted. Nia smiled sadly. "Revenge never feels as good as you think it will. Justice is necessary, but it doesn't heal the hurt, baby. Only time and peace do that. Do you think I should meet with him?" He asked for a meeting. "Do you want to meet with him?" Josiah thought about it. "Part of me wants to hear him explain. To know why we weren't enough. Another part of me thinks nothing he says will matter. Then meet with him, hear what he has to say, and decide afterward. You're in control now, Josiah. He can't hurt you anymore. He's just a sad old man who destroyed his own life." 2 weeks later, Josiah agreed to meet Richard at a small cafe in Kingston, neutral territory, private enough for a difficult conversation. Richard arrived early, nervous in a way he hadn't been since he was a young man. When Josiah walked in, Richard stood awkwardly, unsure whether to offer a handshake or just sit. Josiah sat without ceremony. "You wanted to talk. I'm listening." Richard looked at his son, really looked at him. He saw Nia's strength in his bearing, but also glimpses of himself in the shape of his face, the set of his jaw. I don't expect forgiveness, Richard began. I don't deserve it. What I did to you and your mother was indefensible. I was arrogant, selfish, and cruel. I threw away the most important things in life for status and image, and I paid for it. Is that supposed to make me feel sorry for you? No. I'm just stating facts. You wanted to know why, I think. Why you weren't enough. Josiah, it wasn't about you. You were a baby. Innocent. It was about me and my own insecurities and stupid priorities. That's not an answer. Richard sighed. I was raised to believe that certain things mattered: family name, social position, the right connections. When I met your mother, she was everything I thought I wasn't supposed to want. Real, genuine, from a humble background. I convinced myself I loved her, but I think I just loved the idea of rebelling against my upbringing. And when she got pregnant, I panicked. I realized I'd have to choose between the life I thought I was supposed to live and the life I'd accidentally created. I chose wrong. I chose the wrong woman, the wrong priorities, the wrong everything. Josiah leaned back. Victoria destroyed you the same way you destroyed my mother. Worse, actually. Your mother was innocent. I deserved what Victoria did to me. Karma, your mother would say. What do you want from me, Richard? Josiah asked, using his father's first name deliberately. Nothing. I don't want anything. I just wanted you to know that I see what I missed. You're extraordinary. Everything you've built, everything you've become, I had no part in that except providing a cautionary tale of what not to be. You're right. You had no part in it. I know. And I can live with being a silent investor in your company. I can live with the humiliation and the consequences. What I can't live with is you thinking that my rejection of you had anything to do with your worth. You were always worthy, Josiah. I was just too broken and stupid to see it. Josiah studied his father's face. He saw regret there, genuine and deep. But he also saw a stranger. This man had contributed DNA but nothing else to his life. I don't hate you, Josiah said finally. I did for a while. But mostly I just feel nothing. You're not my father in any way that matters. You're just a biological connection and a business associate. Richard nodded, absorbing the words like blows. But, Josiah continued, my mother raised me to be better than my worst impulses. So I'm going to say this: if you want to know me, if you want to try to build something from nothing, I'm not opposed to it. But you'd be starting from zero. You'd have to earn every conversation, every piece of trust, every moment of connection. I understand. And you need to understand that I'm doing this for me, not you. Because I want to be the kind of man who can extend grace even when it's not deserved. Like my mother did for you all these years, never speaking badly about you even though she had every right to. She's a remarkable woman. Yes, she is. And she's the only parent I've ever needed. You can be something else, maybe. A mentor, an advisor, someone to occasionally talk to. But you'll never be my father. Not in the way that matters. Richard felt tears on his face and didn't wipe them away. That's more than I deserve. Thank you. They talked for another hour. Carefully, cautiously, two strangers trying to find common ground. Josiah told Richard about MIT, about building Optimize Now, about his vision for the future. Richard listened, asked questions, and marveled at the brilliant man his son had become. When they parted, they shook hands. It wasn't warm, but it wasn't hostile either. It was a beginning, fragile and uncertain. Over the following months, they met occasionally. Sometimes for coffee, sometimes for business discussions about the hotel properties. Slowly, carefully, they built a relationship that would never be father and son, but might become something like mutual respect. Richard sold his villa and moved into a modest apartment. He stopped drinking. He started volunteering with a youth mentorship program, helping young people from humble backgrounds navigate careers in hospitality. It was his small way of atoning, though he knew it could never erase what he'd done. Josiah's company continued to grow. Optimize now expanded into resort management, event planning technology, and sustainable tourism initiatives. The company valuation reached $500 million by the time Josiah turned 30. He bought his mother a vacation home on the beach, the one with the garden she had always dreamed about. He set up scholarships for Jamaican students pursuing careers in technology and hospitality. He became a voice for diversity and opportunity in an industry that had often excluded people who looked like him and his mother. Nia retired from her consulting business and spent her time between her two homes, gardening, traveling, and enjoying the fruits of her resilience. She had offers from men interested in dating her, and eventually she started seeing a kind widower who treated her with the respect and love she had always deserved. She forgave Richard, not because he deserved it, but because carrying anger was exhausting and she had better things to do with her peace. 5 years after the gala, Josiah got married to a brilliant engineer he met at a tech conference. Nia cried happy tears at the wedding. Richard attended at Josiah's invitation, sitting in the back, grateful to be included at all. During the reception, Richard watched Josiah dance with Nia, both of them laughing, joy radiating from them. He thought about what his life could have been if he had made different choices 28 years ago. But he also recognized that his bad choices had forced Nia and Josiah to become stronger, more resilient, more extraordinary than they might have been otherwise. Not because of him, but in spite of him. It was a bitter comfort, but it was something. Christopher Dane found Richard at the bar. "How are you holding up?" "I'm okay. Better than I deserve to be." "He's a good man, your son." Nia raised him right. Yes, she did. "You know what the irony is?" Christopher said. "If you had just been decent to them, you could have been part of this all along. Could have watched him grow up, helped him, been proud of him." "I know. Trust me, I know." Richard left the wedding early, taking a taxi back to his small apartment. He had a quiet life now. Simple. Humble. The opposite of everything he'd once valued. But he had something he'd never had before, clarity. He understood now that character mattered more than status. That love mattered more than image. That the people you throw away might be the ones who could have saved you. He just learned it 3 decades too late. Josiah and his wife honeymooned in Bali, then returned to Boston where they bought a beautiful home. They talked about starting a family, and Josiah promised himself that his children would always know they were loved and valued, no matter what. The Hemsley Hotel Group, now fully integrated into Josiah's larger hospitality portfolio, thrived under his leadership. The properties were modernized, sustainable, and more profitable than they'd ever been under Richard's management. Josiah kept his promise. The original Montego Bay Hotel retained the Hemsley name with a historical plaque, founded by Robert Hemsley, 1968. Continued by his son Richard Hemsley. Preserved and modernized by Josiah Campbell, 2019. The plaque told the whole story without spelling it out. Those who knew, understood the irony and the justice. And those who didn't know would eventually hear the story, because it became legendary in the Caribbean hospitality industry. The tale of the son who came back to save the father who abandoned him, not with cruelty, but with success so overwhelming it redefined what justice could look like. So let me ask you, wherever you're watching this from, have you ever seen karma work so perfectly? Have you ever witnessed justice served not with revenge, but with success that makes revenge unnecessary? This story reminds us that what you do in darkness always comes to light. That the people you discard might become the people who determine your fate. That character matters more than status, and love matters more than image. Richard Hemsley learned these lessons the hard way. Nia Campbell already knew them and raised a son who would prove them to the world. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that resilience and dignity will always triumph over arrogance and cruelty, do me a favor. Hit that like button. Subscribe to this channel for more stories about real consequences and real justice. Share this with someone who needs to hear that being underestimated is sometimes the best motivation for success. And comment below. Tell me where you're watching from. Tell me if you've ever witnessed karma in action. Tell me if you believe that what goes around truly comes around. Nia Campbell could have been destroyed by what Richard did to her. Instead, she built a life of dignity, raised an extraordinary son, and lived to see perfect justice served. Richard Hemsley thought he could erase his mistakes and move on. Instead, his mistakes grew up, became more successful than he ever was, and showed him the true cost of his choices. And Josiah Campbell, the baby deemed worthless by his own father, became the man who controlled his father's legacy and extended grace even when it wasn't deserved. That's not just a story about revenge or karma. It's a story about who we choose to be when we have the power to destroy those who hurt us. Josiah chose to be better. Nia chose to be dignified. And Richard was left to live with the consequences of choosing wrong, over and over again. The last I heard, Richard is still living quietly in Kingston, still meeting occasionally with the son he's trying to know 3 decades too late. Still volunteering with young people, trying to prevent them from making his mistakes. Josiah's company is now valued at over $1 billion. He and his wife have 2 children. Nia is a grandmother who spoils her grandchildren and finally lives in the peace she always deserved. And somewhere in heaven, karma is smiling, because it never forgets and it always delivers. Thank you for watching this story. Thank you for being here. Remember to like, subscribe, and share. And never forget, what you do to others will eventually come back to you. Make sure when it does, you can live with the consequences. Until next time, treat people with dignity. Love with integrity. And remember that the people you underestimate today might be the ones who determine your tomorrow. Peace and blessings to you all.